Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third live panel. I'm particularly delighted today to welcome my colleagues, Rosa Balfour, who just joined us, who is now the director of the Carnegie Brussels Center, and Evan Feigenbaum. Sorry, Evan, I think I massacred your name, who is our vice president for Asia. We will be talking today about the whether what we're witnessing is a new chapter in foreign policy towards the Middle East. In other words, we'll be looking at how COVID-19 has impacted policies, the foreign policy of China, the EU, and hopefully if we manage to get our colleague Dmitri Trenin, who's the director of the Carnegie Center in Russia, in Moscow. We'll be able to look at how COVID-19, corona pandemic has impacted China's foreign policy, Russia's foreign policy, and the EU's foreign policy, and what that has meant for this region. Evan, let me just begin with you. You wrote recently about US-China coordination. I think you called it missing in action on coronavirus. And the thrust of that piece was really about how, despite their strategic rivalry, the United States and China have a history of coordination past public health and economic crisis. However, now they seem to be tipping more towards enmity. So the question is, what does that mean for global governance and how we are handling the pandemic, and then obviously for their how is that impacting their respective foreign policies?
Thanks. Well, it's great to join. Great to be with so many terrific colleagues. Yeah, I think you captured it in the setup to that strategic competition, which people talk about now between the United States and China. It's actually not new. It's a feature. It's not a bug of the relationship. If you go back to the modern inception of the relationship, it was the visit in 1972 by then President Richard Nixon to Beijing. But at that time, the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and China was closely aligned with the government of North Vietnam. So strategic competition's always been there, but in the first instance, notwithstanding that competition, there were certain transnational issues that were big enough that the countries, even though they didn't necessarily have common interests, had complementary ones, and for self-interested reasons were able to find their way, not necessarily to cooperation, but to coordination. And I'm thinking here of issues like fighting financial contagion in the financial crisis in 2008, or stopping Ebola at the source in Africa in 2014. That kind of coordination is really unthinkable in the current context, and there are a few reasons for that. The first, as you said in the setup when you quoted my piece, is I think we're moving from an era of what people call strategic competition to something more like managed enmity. And enmity is different from competition because it refracts almost every issue in a relationship back through the prism of security competition. And security competition, unlike, say, economic competition, has a tendency to be very zero-sum. And so the relationship in a lot of ways is really in free fall and without a floor at this point, because a lot of the presumptions that people made have gone by the wayside in the last few years. The most important of those was that after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, that notwithstanding obvious differences of political system and ideology, and as I said, the realities of strategic and security competition, that economic integration would somehow mitigate the most perverse and debilitating effects of that. But that has turned out really not to be the case. The United States and China are enormously integrated economically. You had a $700 billion plus trading relationship. You had more than $100 billion in US foreign direct investment stock in China. You had in 2016 alone about $50 billion in deal flow from China into the United States, hundreds of thousands of students and scholars and tourists and business people going back and forth. But notwithstanding all of that integration, not only has the security competition not been mitigated, but if anything, it's growing worse, particularly in East Asia and places like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. And now, and this is really the key point, it's bleeding back into every other area of the relationship. So flows of goods, capital, people, technology, things that should be integrating the two countries really are being refracted back through this prism of security competition. Why do Americans want to attenuate Chinese investment, for example, in growth companies in Silicon Valley in the United States? Security competition. It's being refracted back through the prism of China's technological advance in areas that have multiple or dual use applications. So if you look at that and you start to globalize it and you think what that means for regions like the Middle East, what you'll start to see is the US-China competition playing out all around the world on the choices that they try to force or not force on third countries and third parties. And that's really a challenge because in the first instance, if no crisis is big enough for those two to coordinate anymore, then that really poses tough functional questions for the rest of the world on things like how to fight a global pandemic or how to deal with the next financial crisis. But it also matters because if we think about the world in terms of function rather than form, then what we're really heading for, I think, is a world of what I would call fragmentation. And fragmentation is a little bit different in my mind to what people like Ian Bremmer call a G0, right? A G0 means there's really no coordination or cooperation. That's not what I mean by fragmentation. Fragmentation really means that function drives form rather than the other way around. And so it's not bipolarity where countries have to choose between the US and China as you would in a bloc-like international system, because most countries don't want to choose between the US and China. So what you'll get is on a whole series of functional issues, shifting coalitions or non-coalitions of countries that have meaningful interests on those functions. In the region I know best, which is East Asia, you can see that play out on something like trade rules. Think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the so-called TPP. When President Obama used to talk about the TPP, he would frame it something like this. He'd say, if the United States doesn't write the rules of trade and investment, China will write the rules. So if that were true, when President Trump withdrew the United States from the TPP, what should have happened? China should have come in and become the rule writer. But in fact, that's not what happened. What happened was that the 11 remaining members of the TPP got together, cohered, solidified the rules, and have now created a rule set and a rule structure in the region with neither the United States nor China in the room. So if you extrapolate from that in that geographic context and on the trade and investment issue to a whole series of other functional issues, what I would argue is that if countries allow function to drive form rather than the other way around, there is the potential to get cooperation in the system despite this fragmentation, but it will require a lot of agency and stepping up for third countries in third regions. And that raises the bar and puts a much greater burden, as Rosa may talk about, on the European Union, on Japan, on others. But the choice set will narrow for countries that don't have the ability to influence rules, norms, and standards globally. And that gets us into some interesting things, I think, in the Middle East, where there are a lot of power differentials between countries and where China has been leveraging economic gravity in some interesting new ways.
Okay, wait, hold that thought. We'll come back to it. I want to move just to build up on what you just said, Evan, with Rosa. Rosa, you've written a lot about how multilateralism and cooperation actually have been at the heart of the project of the EU. Given the tug of war between China and the US, and given the context of Europe today, where even cooperation within the EU itself is considerably strained as a result of COVID-19, how do you see this developing? How do you see this multilateralism developing?
Yeah, no, I think the depiction of the world in terms of fragmentation is actually one that better fits a potential role that the EU could play. And in many respects, it's what the EU has been doing since WTO has been failing. It has been seeking several bilateral trade agreements. Some of them call them sort of spaghetti bowl trade agreements, but putting in those trade agreements certain principles that can be applicable to the multilateral level when the context allows. And I would say that what we can see now of the past few weeks and months of European responses to the pandemic, we had the initial response, the gut response was very nation first driven, borders were closed, there were some pretty nasty incidents amongst the member states, but a few weeks in, it was clear that member states were on the same boat. And now the path is actually towards finding ways to work together. mostly focused on the internal dimension, but there are also some external aspects, and we can talk about those later. So what this suggests to me, if we want to think about multilateralism, if we take Europe as the example of the most multilateral and most integrated region in the world, despite a decade which has severely weakened the capability of the EU to hang in there together, and despite the pandemic, and despite a very faulty start, we are seeing the signs that actually member states are persuaded they need to do things together. So the question is, rather than is the EU going to fall apart, or is the EU not going to be able to strengthen those elements of international, to contribute to those elements of international cooperation, I think the question is, what level of ambition will we see? And so far, we're seeing the EU taking the lead in the major donor conference to support research in international research on medical issues, vaccine infrastructure, health infrastructure. We've seen the EU put forward arguments to G7 and G20 for debt relief for developing countries. And I do think that despite the nationalist voices, despite the instinct to closing borders, shutting off from the world, in the policymaking community, and especially in the policymaking community that deals with international issues, the notion that you can't close the doors to the pandemic outside the borders is there. If neighboring countries are suffering from coronavirus, that's going to reach Europe. And so that's there. It's part of the debate. I'm not saying it's going to prevail, but I think there's strong enough narratives to go in that direction. The question will be level of ambition. I think the EU potentially has an opportunity to find space and niches within this US-China rivalry. I think it's likely that the EU will seek to cooperate with China on anything health and related, so perhaps with WHO, but it's going to be selectively engaging with China. It's very likely that it will pursue greater cooperation with other countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and others, in order to push for multilateralism. So the question is really, what level of ambition and what traction will Europe manage to pursue when it presents itself to the world in such a contradictory way? There's Hungary's, Poland's, migration, member states divided, and all these other things that we'll talk about later today.
This is, it will be interesting to see whether it will be, as you said, it's a question of ambition, and whether it's able to step up and take kind of this more global role that is practically no one is playing that role today in terms of this kind of collective response to the pandemic, which is very much needed. There's no one really leading this in the way we saw, for example, the US lead the financial crisis of 2008. Dmitri, let me turn to you. First, welcome back. Second, I wanted to ask you about Russia. We're seeing a lot of Russia's foreign policy driven very much by domestic, it's the kind of the primacy of national interest. You recently talked about how this gives it a much greater freedom to act. So it's kind of cautious, but at the same time trying to exploit the opportunities that are opening up as a result of this pandemic. On the one hand, it has its own internal challenges. On the other hand, there are foreign policy opportunities that are opening up. Can you please comment a little bit as to where you see Russia going and how you see this playing out?
Well, Maha, thank you very much for this. Glad to be on the panel. I think that when you look out into the world from Russia, you first of all see challenges. Russia is placed in this pandemic driven world between the two poles of, between the two sources of a pandemic. One is China, the other one is Europe. So Russia got its infection from both sides. In fact, Russia today has passed an important milestone in having registered 100,000 people infected with COVID, and for the first time, more than 100 people died in one single day. So it's the beginning of the, I think, very painful period for Russia. The next couple of weeks, maybe longer, when we will bear the brunt of this epidemic. As to the opportunities, I don't think that there are too many opportunities around. One of the most important casualties of the pandemic has been the economic crisis, the collapse of communication among people, and the collapse of the oil price. The collapse of the oil price means a lot to Russia. And it's anyone's guess when the situation will start to improve and to what extent it might improve. It's more likely than not that we will not see for a long time the levels of oil prices that we've been having in the last, say, decade or so. So it's trying times for Russia. You may say that, Russia's general worldview has been confirmed by the developments. The worldview essentially meaning that it's the nation state that runs the show. That's the most important actor. It's not alliances, not blocs, not associations. It's the nation state. It's also the fact that China has emerged, at least so far, as more of a global force, and the United States has walked away, another few steps away from global leadership. You may say it agrees with the Russian view of things, but Russia can take very little consolation from that, really. Thinking that the issues within the European Union, the rise of, say, nationalism, if I may use that expression, within the European Union gives some advantages to Russia. I think it would be a naive view. Russia will still find going in Europe very, very difficult for it. Even goodwill gestures such as humanitarian assistance to Italy will be immediately suspected as a cynical attempt to exploit the pandemic for ulterior political, geopolitical, and other motives. In fact, the most important test that Russia has had to face in this crisis has been its relationship with China. And the relationship has been put to a fairly severe test, as both countries thought about their national interest first, and only then about other considerations. Russia did not think twice about closing the Chinese border when it was clear that a wave of pandemic may be about to enter from the Far East. Now the Chinese did the same when they discovered that many Chinese nationals who were coming back to China from Russia had been infected with COVID. It took Putin and Xi a couple of conversations to smooth things out and reestablish the relationship at the high level that it has been running at. But it's a clear signal that both countries will look at their national interest first, and there were mutual recriminations that had to be sorted out by the top leaders of the two countries. It's also clear, talking about the coming US-China bipolarity, that Russia will find it hard to manage this bipolarity. It will need a very carefully designed and well executed foreign policy strategy for Russia to keep an equilibrium between Beijing and Washington, I'm not talking equidistance. I think Russia will be in the foreseeable future much closer to Beijing than it would be to Washington for geopolitical and many other reasons. But keeping an equilibrium is absolutely a must for Russia. And it will be hard, especially with the oil price that's running as low as it has been running in the last couple of months. So let me stop here. It's not.
Actually, let me ask you here, because this kind of bridges back to the next round I wanted to ask, and to Evan. We've seen greater cooperation, at least when it comes to the Middle East, between Russia and China. The most recent is an attempt by both the Russians and the Chinese to get sanctions lifted against the Syrian regime. Before that, we saw a joint military exercise, which included Iran and the Gulf of Oman. So are we going to see more and more of this kind of cooperation? And how far will this develop? What will determine this cooperation? And once you've done, I'll come back to, or maybe let me just give you a break and ask Evan this question, and then we can come back to Dmitri.
You're the queen here, so.
Yeah, my presumption is that we will see more of that kind of thing, partly because Washington is the target for Beijing and for Tehran and for others. But I do think it's worth stepping back and thinking a little bit about what it is that China is able to leverage globally. You know, you alluded to two things that we hear a lot of now. One is that China's sending medical supplies to the Middle East and around the world. And the implication of that is China's somehow leveraging soft power. And then the second is, when we talk about bipolarity, the implication is that there's a contest of systems, as if China cared about global governance and was trying to create some kind of system of global governance. I don't think really either one of those is the principal play for China. China doesn't have much of a soft power play because there's no love for China anywhere. And the closer you get to China's own borders, the nearer you are in your periphery, the more you have interest-based calculations for the countries around there and for the Chinese, frankly, themselves. And then in terms of global governance, I mean, as Dmitri not just implied, but said, I mean, for China, it's a very national interest-based calculation. So I really think if you think about what the Chinese are able to leverage globally, it's two things. It's economic gravity. And then in Asia in particular, it's the map. It's not really soft power or a set of broadly coherent ideas about every aspect of global governance that leverages some sort of love for China around the world. The map is meaningful for things like the Belt and Road. It's less of an issue for the Middle East because it's not contiguous, but if you think just about China's sheer size and scope, and this is meaningful for Russia. Dmitri and I spend a lot of time talking about, Eurasia, Central Asia. China is contiguous to every other region of Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia. You just go around the map. And so it is possible to leverage the map in the way that China's strategic competitors, including the United States, cannot. You can build a highway from Tajikistan to Western China. You can't build a bridge from Kyrgyzstan to California. And so if you think about things like infrastructure finance, China can leverage the map in the way that others cannot. And frankly, the European Union cannot. But that's not the end of the story. The story is also about economic gravity. And here's where COVID gets interesting. China, the economy shrank in the first quarter. It contracted 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020. And what China's been able to do in terms of economic gravity is really to leverage two things. It's a demand driver and it's a capital exporter. So the first challenge is it needs to reinflate demand. So if you think about extractive economies that are commodity exporters to China, where China's able to leverage that as a source of influence. A lot of that going forward, at least in the near term, depends a lot on how the Chinese demand picture looks. As a capital exporter, there's been a lot of money sitting on the balance sheets of Chinese corporates. There's a lot of money sitting in policy banks. That's not just in the Belt and Road in terms of formal programs. It's sitting in a lot of funds. There's things like the Silk Road Fund. Chinese entities have set up all kinds of funds. State capitalism is grand. I mean, you can take money right off the top of the foreign exchange administrator, park it in these funds, and then you plow it into investments around the world. The Chinese have been able to leverage that. My expectation is there'll be less of that kind of money to go around. And also, I think the scrutiny both of how China uses its money in the recipient countries will be much greater, but also, frankly, the diligence and scrutiny at home on the kinds of lending that China has done will be greater because the expectation for yield and return on investment will be greater from the top in China. But what I always say about that is in a lot of places where China has been able to leverage capital, but also economic gravity, you don't need a lot of money to make a difference. And nature abhors a vacuum. So if you then filter that through the lens of the strategic competition, the United States, for example, I'm American, right? The United States is just not present in a lot of places in a lot of regions. In 2/3 of the Eurasian landmass, the United States is diplomatically challenged and commercially irrelevant. And so, and the US doesn't have a model of project finance, for example. You know, we, the United States, we don't do state-backed lending through state-backed policy banks where we can plow billions of dollars into these state-backed contracts with corporations. We have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It's just a different model of finance. So a lot of what the United States does, for example, it's really about business and investment. It's not about the way governments are able to lever that. So my expectation is that's still going to be a tool for China, and that will be attractive in regions like the Middle East, where it's not just Chinese push, but that there is a demand side pull for that. And we often talk about China, what China exports. China exports its money, China exports its model, China exports its values. That is a big part of the story. But we forget that there's a demand side, not just a supply side. And I think in many regions, there's a demand side pull for what China is selling that will continue to enable China to be able to do what it does effectively, albeit less comprehensively, given the new kind of economic setup. And if you want to see that, I can make it specific for you with one instance. Just think about the Chinese presence in Africa. The last time I was in the Emirates, for instance, if you're sitting in Dubai and you're looking to make Dubai a financial center post-Brexit for servicing capital inflows into Africa, it's attractive to think about co-finance things with China, to think about how you might make Dubai a financial center for Chinese funds that want to go into third countries and to leverage Islamic finance vehicles, for example, into third regions. I think those are the kinds of things China will begin to experiment with. And so Chinese entities will assimilate local forms, work through local actors, work in ways that reflect that demand side pull, not just export what China's selling. And that's a much more complicated setup. And it also is why I expect China not to just disappear, notwithstanding some of the tougher economic realities.
Oh, that's actually very interesting, Evan. Sorry, before I go to Rosa, let me come back to you, Dmitri, on the question of Russia-China cooperation, and then what that means for the region, but also for the conflicts of the region, which Evan did get a chance to touch on, particularly Syria in this case. But I mean, Russia has a influence in Libya today. It's not just in Syria anymore.
Right. I think that there are clear limits.
And the joint exercise with China and Iran, obviously, in December. Do we read too much into it or too little?
Okay. Thank you again, Maha. I think that there are, I agree with Evan that this cooperation will continue, but I would also add that this cooperation has clear limits. China and Russia are active in different domains. Russia is active in the political military domain, whereas China is active in the economic domain, in particular in those parts of economic domain where Russia is basically absent. China has been very, China's had a habit of hiding behind Russia's back for years when Russia was in the front line of opposing US moves, US allied moves in the UN Security Council, and China would hide behind Russia's back. There's a little bit more coordination now, and China sometimes walks out of Russia's shadow and votes alongside Russia against certain things or proposing certain things that run counter Western policies or Western thinking. But if you look at another aspect of the Syrian story, Russia is adamant that reconstruction, an international effort to reconstruct Syria begins, and it has been spending a lot of time trying to cajole the Europeans to, to collaborate on that. And the Europeans, for clear political reasons, refused to do that. But there's China with tons of money, with a lot of experience, with competence and infrastructure and many other things. But China is not interested in collaborating with Russia, where Russia takes care of the political and military side of the Syrian story, and the Chinese rebuild the Syrian infrastructure, rebuild Syrian cities, because it's not in China's interest to do that. So you don't
also with the coronavirus, with the pandemic and the economic repercussions of the pandemic.
Right, but even before that, it's very interesting that you have two countries that essentially have it between the two of them all the capacity that they need to put Syria back together again, and but China is not cooperating with Russia, and you talked about the military, or in this case naval exercises. I think it's a token show of some kind of collaboration, a sort of solidarity, but I wouldn't read too much into that. China is certainly looking at Iran as a source of oil and other commodities that it needs, but China is much more interested in collaborating with the Arab Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the others. So it's playing on both sides of the Gulf. As far as Russia is concerned, again, the Syrian story shows that Russia wants to stay in contact, keep relations with all relevant players in the region, without coming too close with any of them, or without alienating anyone too much. So yes, there's a little bit of a show here. It does not constitute, will not constitute any kind of a military alliance. In fact, the Russian ships that took part, a couple of ships, I think, took part in this exercise, they were en route from India, where they had been exercising with the Indian Navy, and along the way they exercised with the. So it's military PR more than anything else. So that's the state of things. There will be collaboration, more collaboration, but this collaboration will stay within limits.
Thank you, Dmitri. Rosa, let me move to you and ask about the EU policy towards this region. Given what we've just heard about China and Russia, where does the EU find itself, and how do you think the challenges posed by the pandemic are both influencing the EU's foreign policy in general, but particularly towards the Middle East? Rosa?
Yes, let's start from just the response that we've seen so far, which has been focused mostly on emergency, on humanitarian issues, mobilization of about 20 billion. None of it is new money, but there is a recognition of the need of the interdependence between the EU and the neighborhoods, simply because of proximity, geographical proximity. Having said this, the EU has moved from some very grand plans in the 1990s, which have gradually fizzled out a bit like a balloon. So we had this sort of vision of Euro-Mediterranean, which progressively became overtaken both by events, but most specifically by divisions among the member states. These divisions remain. On Mediterranean countries, in particular Libya, France and Italy, the two most important actors, are pretty hopelessly divided. We've seen divisions over Syria, we're struggling with Turkey. It has been a pretty hopeless situation. And migration and the fear of the influx of refugees has severely undermined the ability of the EU to deal with any of these crises in a holistic way. So this is the situation. On the other hand, for all the countries that have that from North Africa and the Middle East that look into the Mediterranean, the EU remains quite an important trade and aid actor. So in principle, there is leverage there. It doesn't use it, but it has it, number one. And number two, I wouldn't write off the experience of the EU with respect to Iran and the JCPOA. Now, we all know it has failed, but until Trump pulled the US out of that agreement, it was an example of what can be achieved. And I think there's some kind of paradox in a way where the EU has greater interests, and that is in the littoral states of the Mediterranean, and where it has greater stakes, it's less able to act because of its own divisions. Elsewhere, it's stuck to its unity in the face of its transatlantic relationship. And I think this potentially, bearing in mind the context of US-China rivalry, potentially it shows some possible niches where the EU could play a role. I don't think China is going to step up in addressing any of the multiple conflicts that are afflicting the Middle East. I don't think it's interested in doing that. The EU could perhaps offer some diplomacy in order to work that way, perhaps following some of the achievements in the 15 years of talks with Iran over the JCPOA. So there are other potential things, perhaps, that the EU could do should the geopolitical situation in the region change. Because at the moment, we're talking about this region as if it was sort of, this is how it is. It's not necessarily how it's going to evolve, because the pandemic will also change the geopolitical calculus and the power relations between actors in the region, and perhaps more so than coronavirus, what's happening with oil. I mean, if we're moving towards an oil-free Middle East, that is going to alter in significant ways the relations between the actors in the region, and that's perhaps where the EU can seek some kind of role. So it's contradictory what I'm saying. I understand that's what the EU is about at the moment. But it does have potential trade and aid assets, economic tools, and also, I think, some diplomatic clout that it could spend better in the region, given the vital interests that the EU has in stabilizing the region.
Well, we have a couple of questions from the audience. One is for you particularly, Rosa. The other is for, I think, the three of you. The question from the audience, and it kind of built up. I mean, the High Commissioner Josep Borrell just announced recently that they're allocating 20 million in aid to Iran. They've also supported Iran's bid for 5 billion in aid from the IMF. The fast dispersing facility that was created post-corona. So it would be interesting to see how far the EU will go in terms of, at least on the humanitarian front, trying to support Iran. And the question from the audience is, how effective is the INSTEX, the instrument support of trade exchanges, in the long term for Europe in terms of aid to Iran? And then the question following from that, from Jean Abinader for the three of you, is on Turkey specifically, that it seems to be undecided as to how to manage its relationship with China, Russia, and the EU. So do any of you have some sort of a take on what that could mean post-pandemic? Just one last thought, Rosa, you talked about, we don't know what the, how far, basically what we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So some think that this region still hasn't peaked. We're still, at least some countries in the region are still, there's a month of time lag between this region and the European Union, for example, or European countries. We don't know. But the idea is that the impact of the pandemic on the political, on the economic and on the political is going to be medium to long term. This is not ending now. Just as a comment on what you're saying. So if you could take that question.
Yeah, on Iran, I mean, the EU has been willing to offer a helping hand, and I think that's been fairly well taken from Iran, but it hasn't modified its behavior, this pre-pandemic behavior with respect to So it's been an attempt. The EU is, partly clinging on to this because it was until recently it was seen as one of the greatest foreign policy successes, but it hasn't been sufficiently persuasive with the Iranian government to modify its behavior, but also hasn't been persuasive with respect to the US. And Instex, and it's a shame, it's a missed opportunity. Instex simply came too late. It took quite a long time to get all the mechanisms moving. So it turns out it's too little, too late in the face of US sanctions. Shall I just move in or just say something on Turkey, or do you want to hear from the others?
No, go ahead on Turkey. Go ahead on Turkey.
Yeah,
the point was
Turkey
moving to no oil Middle East, an oil-free. Yeah. We're not moving to oil-free Middle East. But go ahead on Turkey.
So Turkey, I think my personal opinion is that Turkey is one of the greatest foreign policy failures of the European Union. Turkey has been highly dependent on Europe for economic reasons, and we know that it currently is going through quite a dire economic crisis, which predates coronavirus, and we'll see how that's going to play out. And the EU has squandered what leverage it might have had in light of its perceived needs to cooperate with Turkey on the refugee issue. So the relationship has gone the other way. Whereas before the EU had some leverage and influence, now it's gone completely the other way in the sense that Turkey can blackmail European states. However, I think Turkey has got itself into a bit of a pickle, and I'm not sure how it's going to go out. So I think it will have to change its blocks, with respect to NATO, with respect to Syria, with respect to relationship with Russia, relationship with the US. So perhaps something will happen, in Turkey's foreign policy calculus. And finally, also domestically, Erdogan is clearly very nervous about competition from Istanbul mayor and other mayors as well, Izmir, for instance. We'll see how that plays out internally. So it's a kind of watch this space, but I don't see the EU having a clear strategy on dealing with Turkey. Largely handcuffed. It's handcuffed itself because of the refugee issue, and that's the internal EU conditions simply haven't changed, even if at the moment the pressure is much lesser, or the pressure on European borders is much lesser than in the past.
Adam, do you want to say anything on Turkey, China?
On Turkey? Well, it's been a long time since I've been in Ankara, and the last time I was there was to talk mostly about Central Asia, not China. But I guess the one thing I'd say...
Or Egypt. There's also a question on Egypt.
Well, we can go back to Egypt. I do think Turkey kind of encapsulates some of what I was saying at the beginning about, I don't know if the right word is schizophrenic, but the complex relationships that countries have with China. I mean, my impression is that it's been quite volatile over the last few years because there are pieces of that relationship and of Chinese choices and behavior that offend certain Turkish sensibilities. The treatment of Uyghurs in China is the most pregnant example. It offends kind of lingering senses of pan-Turkism in Turkey, but it also is something that actually the government of Turkey has spoken out about in public, not just privately, and that's created. It was brave and good of the government of Turkey to do so, but obviously that's created some volatility. On the other hand, the worse the Turkish economy performs, the more China will be seen as an attractive provider of capital and other economic public goods. And then those questions about economic gravity begin to kick in as well. I also think that the interest in needling Washington is one that brings a lot of countries together with China, not in a comprehensive way, but as Dmitri was saying when he talked before about the show aspect of naval exercises, it's something where people find China to be an attractive ad hoc partner in all sorts of different ways. So I think there is that kind of schizophrenia in that relationship, but I don't see a lot of love there.
Okay. Dmitri?
Well, I think that for Turkey that I think has redefined itself under the current president as a lonely power, a regional player with a multi-vector foreign policy. The trick is to use all those other vectors, including the one to China and the one to Russia, to manage the relationship with the United States more on the terms that Turkey would prefer, to carve out a special relationship very much tilted toward the Turkish interest with the United States. And I think they have been fairly successful with that. That Turkey has been able to get away with the things that no other NATO country has been able to get away with. And it's still a NATO ally, it's still an American ally. The question that I have in my mind is, to what extent is the policy pursued by Erdogan is well entrenched within the Turkish elite? And beyond Erdogan, what will we see in Turkey's foreign policy? Which path it will take later? As for Russia-Turkey relations, it's a boom-bust relationship. There's no special trust in that relationship. It's a sheer meeting of interests. Sometimes it's a meeting of interests succeeded by a clash of interests, and then it's patched up, and then there's another common or something that looks like a joint adventure or a joint agreement, which the Russians would say is normally not adhered to by the Turkish side. The Turks would say that the Russians are not seeing them as an equal partner. So it's a difficult relationship, but this difficult relationship on balance is a plus for Russia, because Russia has been able to do the things that it has been able to do in Syria to a large degree because of Turkey's collaboration, to the extent this collaboration has been possible. But Russia has no illusions about Turkey, which is, I think, a good thing.
How do you see then, in that case, Russia's relationship with Iran developing? We've been seeing a lot, and you've written recently about how Russia is using the pandemic to try and consolidate its position in Syria and kind of take over, not marginalize, but push Iran to the side on some issues.
Well, Iran has been a problematic country even to its partners or would-be partners or have partners, whatever, and Russia is in that category. So in Syria, of all places, Iran's influence has been always in competition with Russia's influence. From the Russian perspective, not all Iranian influence, and I'll be very charitable about that, is welcome by the Russians in Syria. So when Iran has problems elsewhere, the Russians, as Evan said, geopolitics abhors vacuums. So even if it's not a complete, even if it's a reduction in Iran's attention, in the level of Iran's attention, Russia will be using that. At the same time, Russia is keeping in touch with Iran, as it's keeping in touch with everyone in that region. So it's a relationship that cannot be and should not be described in the terms that you apply for modern relations among European countries or between Western. It's a different part of the world where alliance does not exactly mean what an alliance means in Europe, and partnership means a slightly different thing than it means in the Western world. And Russians, being not novices to the region, have long learned to play those games and have been playing those games and will continue to play those games with those partners, including with Iran.
Let me then end with, thank you, Dmitri, for that. Let me end with a question for the three of you, and I'll start since the microphone is with you, Dmitri, at least the virtual microphone. The last question also from the audience is, And I think, Rosa, you triggered this by talking about an oil-free Middle East, which is not really an oil-free Middle East, but at least where the shock of the oil prices has been tremendous and will have second and third order effects in this region. In terms of Russia, we saw this OPEC plus deal signed not too long ago. We don't know whether it will hold or not. But the question that is being asked is, how will this plunge in oil prices, which from what we can see is the effect will be with us for some time now. How will this plunge affect the balance of power in the region and the strategy of the different global powers we've talked about? Let me start with you, Dmitri.
Well, Mr. Putin has just been holding a meeting with his energy barons, if you like, to discuss the future of the energy complex in Russia. It's a serious issue, and depending on where you see the oil price a few months away, a couple of years away, or in the longer term, you will have to adjust or completely redesign your economic policy. And I think a redesign of economic policy would also implicate a redesign of your political policy, if you like. The whole structure of domestic politics will have to change. I don't think we have an answer at this point. What we are seeing, is this the beginning of the end, or is this just a reduction in a long-term reduction in the price of oil? I think that the Russians are seeing this very seriously. They still have a cushion that could last a couple of years. You can still continue with your policies in the foreseeable future, but later on you will have to change things in a fundamental way if the world is turning to a place where oil is fundamentally cheaper than it has been. Then Russia would have to look for other means of sustaining itself. It may be a blessing in disguise, because it's an old adage that oil-rich economies, especially when the price is high, are notoriously slow or unwilling to reform. They are not using their much more important potential than much more important factors, productive factors than oil. I think Russia is certainly misusing and neglecting the most important productive factor that it has, which is the demographic potential. Even though Russia is a much smaller or much less crowded place, but the quality is still appreciably high, and Russia is not using that potential as it should be. Instead, it's going after raw materials things, and that is a big question. So it's a double-edged sword. Or you may say, if oil continues to plunge and the Russian budget runs out of money, Russia cannot sustain itself, it could be a recipe for major upheaval that can have negative results, frankly. Bring in a bit of disruption, a bit of, wouldn't use the word chaos, but going in that direction, which will not serve the country well, or anyone for that matter.
Rosa, let me turn to you on the same issue.
Yeah, I think, should the world seize the opportunity of the coronavirus pandemic to shift towards fossil fuel-free energy, I think this will have huge transformative impact. And in the Middle East in particular, I mean, when you read your textbooks on the international relations of the Middle East, oil is such a building block of those relations. I mean, it shapes the relationship, all the major cleavages in the region. Having said that, and of course, it would be an opportunity for Europe and European companies and European societies because of, the availability and preparedness of renewable energy, the renewable energy sector here in Europe. Having said this, there have been projects for supporting solar grids in North Africa that have been blocked for years over the conflict in Western Sahara. So basically, these things, they can, you can imagine a different world, but it doesn't mean that the old problems are going to go away. So I guess we need to think of it in these terms. However, if this were to happen, which I wouldn't exclude, because partly because of events, partly because of public opinion trends, partly because the pandemic is going to strengthen the digital economy. It's going to bring changes to our ways of life. It will have huge implications, and we need to think them through quite carefully.
Thanks, Rosa. Evan?
Same question.
The last word.
All right. Well, I think it's important. I think it's important to look at that through both vectors. One is energy, and then the other is non-energy. And the second is interesting and important because it gets us back to where we started, in a sense, which is with China and what kind of power China is, and partly what its appeal is. I mean, on the energy piece, I think a lot depends on the reinflation of demand in China and what the demand picture looks like going forward. China has become a player with a number of oil producers. It's navigated relationships with both Iran and Saudi Arabia fairly well, and others as well. And it's got global companies now that are involved in production and drilling. But if you look at the trajectory on what China hopes to do with its fuel mix, and if you look at the trajectory from the 12th five-year plan to the 13th five-year plan, they're now formulating a 14th five-year plan. It's pretty clear that gas and nuclear are in some sense the winners, and coal and oil are meant to be the losers. And before the demand picture began to really change in China, the targets for gas in particular were really ambitious. The Chinese State Planning Agency a few years ago had a target of something like 420 BCM of gas just for, I think, the greater Beijing area alone. So the demand picture is going to matter, but it's also clear that changes in the fuel mix and Chinese energy strategy are going to matter. And if you think that the future of energy is driven not just by traditional issues of security and cost, but also by technology and the advance of technology, and then the link between technology and decarbonization. China wants to be both a technology leader, but also a deployer of new technology in energy in ways that are designed to change its fuel mix. So that inevitably will refract back into its relationships with oil producers. I think the more interesting question is the non-energy question, because then this brings us back in a sense to where we started with my answer to the first question you asked me. You know, China's not just about energy in the Middle East anymore. It provides a provider of capital, that's the Belt and Road. It's a provider of other bases of expertise. And so if you want to posit a world that's kind of Middle Eastern economies that are struggling to make adjustments in terms of their economic structure, asking hard questions about where the growth is going to come from, thinking about things like workforce development and skills development, you can see why China is an attractive partner for not every country, but for many governments and for many of the ruling elites in the region, as a capital provider, as a trainer, as a country that can help to diversify those economies in interesting ways. And so, you know, whether that actually becomes tangible, what that means beyond extractive industries, because so many of China's relationships in the region are still driven by extractive sectors and partnerships. That's interesting. But I think if you think on a 15, 20-year time horizon, you can see why, as I said, there's not just a supply side push from China, but a demand side pull within the region that's looking to China as a prospective and in some cases actual partner on a much wider variety of things than just drilling and thinking about the future of extractive industries. And that really is the question. How does that kind of potential turn into something actual? And then how do others, how does the United States, how does the European Union, how do others respond to that? Because inevitably, it will be an enabler of greater Chinese influence in the Middle East and in the broader region, and on a much more diverse set of platforms and bases than I think has been the case when I look in the rear view at the last 20 years. I think the jury's out on that, but it is an interesting set of vectors for the advance of Chinese power that could have the potential to change the region in some pretty interesting ways.
I think change the region and change the world in many ways. God, I want to thank you all very, very much for a fascinating discussion. Rosa, Evan, Dmitri, it's been wonderful to have you on this panel, and I guess we'll be in touch very soon, all of us. And thanks to our audience out there. So thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.